Hi, Lena. Hi, Jim. So nice to see everyone today. I don't know if you've been outside, but it is gorgeous. So it's a great way to start Friday, and starting it with you too is also a pleasure. So I just want to welcome everyone. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. I'm here with our special guest, who is also an alumna, Lena Denny. She is a Geospatial Data, GIS, and Maps librarian with the Sheridan Library's Data Services. Now, before I turn the program over to Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Libraries, I encourage you to ask questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to Mr. Williams.
Hello, I am Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Johns Hopkins Sheridan Libraries. On behalf of the Friends, I am delighted to welcome you to today's Lunch with the Libraries and Museums talk. We are grateful to Jamie and our co-sponsors, the Johns Hopkins Alumni Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity Group for helping us to present this speaker series and to highlight the vital role of the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums in supporting Hopkins faculty and students. Today's program also highlights the philanthropic impact of our generous community of friends. Many of the historic maps that you will see today were gifts to the libraries. In fact, several from our recently acquired Willard Hackerman collection. They also were able to be processed, conserved, and digitized thanks to donor support. Thank you, Nancy Hackerman. As a result, we are able to share them for study and enjoyment for generations to come. If you are already a friend of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, thank you for making this important work possible. If you haven't yet become a friend, please consider doing so by making a gift of $75 or more at library.jhu.edu. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Lena Denny. She is a graduate of the Johns Hopkins class of 2011 and a longtime friend of the libraries. Lena is the Geospatial Data, GIS, and Maps librarian of the Sheridan Libraries. As part of the Data Services Unit, she provides services and sources that enable faculty and students to discover, explore, visualize, and curate geospatial information. She holds an MS in Library and Information Science from Simmons University, an MA in History of Arts from Courtauld Institute of Art, and a BA in Anthropology and History of Art from Johns Hopkins University. Lena is clearly an accomplished scholar. She is also a lovely young lady, probably a reflection of her wonderful parents, Deborah and Andre, who have been long-term friends of the libraries as well. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Lena Denny.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. If you're also on the East Coast, I'm going to share my screen as I start to talk to you. So hopefully you're all seeing something that says the foundation and the gateway, and I trust the panelists will chime in if there are any issues with my sound or my video. So as I was so kindly introduced just now, I am Lena Denny, and I am the Geospatial Data, GIS, and Maps librarian in the Data Services Department of the Sheridan Libraries. And today I'm going to be speaking about maps in our collection that show the history and development of Baltimore. It is definitely not a comprehensive tour of Baltimore's history. It's only a small number of maps, but I hope it will give you an overview of some particularly interesting growth points for the city and the region. And I always like to begin any talk I give about maps with the crucial point that maps are not neutral materials. They are, by their very definition, a biased view of the world because they're a two-dimensional abstraction of three-dimensional space and time. No map can capture everything, and even when they're trying to be objective, which is not a given because of maps' long use for military and imperial purposes, maps will leave out details and distort the ones that they do include. So with that in mind, I hope you'll see today not only what maps of Baltimore show you explicitly, but also what they imply and what they hide. I've chosen to discuss this according to the framework of the foundation and the gateway, which I'll explain in a bit. And I also want to note that I'm going to give you the link to this presentation that I'm showing you now when I'm done, so that you can refer back to the image and links if you would like to spend more time on any of them than I'm able to do with you now. So the first order of business is that I would like to do a land acknowledgement before we get any further. I am a white settler descendant whose family has been in North America since the 17th century, but there were already people here for thousands of years whose land they encroached upon. And I'm speaking to you today from my home in Baltimore City, which lies on the ancestral homeland of numerous nations from whom this land was taken, sometimes by treaty, but more often by financial pressure and illegal treaty violations. These nations, which are shown on this map, were the Susquehannock people, you can see up here in this block, and also the Nanticoke people here on the coast, mainly in what is now Delaware, and the Piscataway people in this region, whose name is usually anglicized as Piscataway. You can see the bounds of their territory here thanks to a really amazing resource run out of Canada called Native Land Digital. And I highly encourage you to visit their site, which again, I have linked here so you can do that after this presentation. I highly encourage you to visit their site and see who once lived and still lives in your area. One of their many great features is that you can use their API to embed a map on your own site that only covers the coordinates you specify, which is exactly what I've done here, using Baltimore's coordinates as the centroid. If I had embedded a full North America map here, this would be absolutely covered in overlapping polygons and not just these ones that you see in this region. If you've never heard a land acknowledgement before, you'd like to learn more, I've also linked a very eloquent land acknowledgement statement here that was written by the Association of Research Libraries. It's actually specific to Washington, D.C., so it even mentions some of the same nations that I've named that overlap in this region, as well as others along the Potomac River and further south into Virginia. And we will return to the indigenous inhabitants of this land in a few moments, but first I'm going to back up and tell you more about the map collection. So here I have linked our LibGuide, which tells you a bit about the history of the map collection and our collecting strengths. It is Maryland in general, but as you might imagine, especially Baltimore. And as was referred to in the introduction, I am in the data services department. It's where my position is housed and it's where the map collection is housed. And we are part of we're on A level in normal non-pandemic times, although we're all working remotely now, but we're located on A level of MSC Library. And the maps came to be as they are now because of earlier collecting practices, many of which came actually from government repository practices. So the map collection used to be more integrated into the government publications, which are still very much a part of the library. This was a common thing where university libraries, big research libraries in particular, had a status where they would receive government deposits in the mid 20th century. This was kind of a post-World War II innovation that meant that many major map libraries around the country were built often with the basis of federal maps and state maps. And so this was certainly true for us at Johns Hopkins. We received many government deposits between the 1960s and 1980s in particular. And also we've had, as was mentioned by Jim, we've had on top of that, some really incredible gifts, amazing gifts from some very generous private donors. And one that has come up already and will come up again is the incredible gift of historical maps and prints from Lillian P. and Willard Hackerman. The Hackerman family kindly donated dozens of incomparable maps and prints to our collection in 2017. I'm actually linked a little, these links are all live if you're looking at this presentation later. So there's some information about that here. But this was a gift given to us in 2017. And honestly, there's some of the most beautiful and interesting maps that you'll see anywhere. And fortunately, as mentioned, their gift included digitization for these materials, so they can be consulted in J Scholarship. And because of that, you're going to see many of them in this presentation. And J Scholarship is the open access repository for our digital images. Again, you can get it from anywhere and it's open access, so it's open use, but also our maps are discoverable in the library catalog, which is called Catalyst and is referred to on this page. So we will be getting to these incredible maps from the map collection, but before we do that, I want to orient you with one more map that I've made myself. And this is to show using some data layers that we have in data services. One of the many wonderful perks of working in data services is that I have a lot of fun tools and toys to play with. And one of them is really great map layers. So I've created this geological layer using some USGS information. And this gives you the geology of Maryland. I've also included this little image that breaks down from the Maryland Geological Survey what the different geological regions of Maryland are. So you can see that there is a huge variety for a state of this size. And of course, it's a very funny shape because of the southern border being the Potomac River, which we'll come back to. But the Atlantic coastal plain, which includes us, and although we're really right on the edge with the fall line, this is the Atlantic Seaboard fall line, basically where Baltimore sits. You can also see it delineated on the geological layer by this dark green line that cuts the very shallow, flat coastal plain of Maryland, of the Eastern Shore, of Virginia, North Carolina, but up also into New Jersey and New York, going up the Eastern Seaboard, essentially. Cuts this off from the Piedmont region and from the mountainous regions that we have to the west, the Alleghenies and the Appalachians more generally. Another thing too that's so important about this region is the riverways. So you see a few, again, including the Potomac and several of the other rivers that are really famous, the Patapsco, on which Baltimore sits. But then you can also see with this really deep indentation here, the mighty Susquehanna, as it is called, one of the most ancient rivers on Earth, so prominent, again, that you can see it in the topographic map. And its drowned river valley created none other than the Chesapeake Bay. So what you hopefully get from this is that there's access to a ton of farmland, but also a lot of water power that makes mills and factories possible and their transportation. And so where Baltimore fits in, there's the really fun part if this loads correctly, because you can tilt these data layers when you create them in this tool that I used, is where Baltimore fits into that is that it is really important for location. So it's within this wider location that's really interesting and really important. And also the area that became Baltimore is very well located to take advantage of it. So these data layers that I've included here, this was the original topographic layer. And this happens sometimes with web-based platforms. Retiling on map layers is very common. So that will eventually resolve, but maybe not before I'm done with it. So if you have that happen to you later, if you play with this, just sit back and relax and wait for it to resolve. But essentially, you can see here, I've put several more data layers. So these are port layers here. These are specifically icons for roll-off, roll-on ports, which are the most specialized kind of massive cargo ports that you can get on the Eastern Seaboard and other places as well. But if you look at this, so these roll-on, roll-off facilities are well suited here because Baltimore's harbor is very, very deep. And it is also the furthest western port on the Eastern Seaboard. It is so far inland to make it the westernmost port, which connects it very well to farmland, as I briefly mentioned before, especially once the railroads came. So that's what these black lines are, is I've also overlaid a railroad layer. So you can see just how they just spike off into the countryside. And you can also see the vegetation and ground cover variety in all the pretty colors I've got here. So this is a vegetation, it's a forestry data layer that I've added. It uses color to show the variety of things like the deep pine forest and the Allegheny Mountains, but also contrasting with the marshy vegetation of the shoreline. And then all of this lovely flat land in the middle for the farmland that made this region really rich. You can see, you can drag it along and play with that if you like. So now that you have that background, let's get on to the maps that you've come here to see. And this is also the first Hackerman map, gift map in the presentation, the John Smith Virginia map of 1612, the first quote unquote detailed map. And now, first of all, you might say, well, look, I came for maps of Maryland and this says Virginia. Well, yes, so Maryland doesn't exist yet. That's 20 years away from the point of this publication, but you can see the patterns that determine Maryland's existence already coming into play here. It's also worth noting that along with the wide ranges in forestry and the changes, there were very different animals as well as really different land at this point, which affected the hunting a lot, not only for the nations that lived here before, but also for the European nations that came later. There were bison present in the Powhatan territory of Virginia and bison within 100 miles of Baltimore until the 19th century. Actually, that's not true, until a little bit before then, but into settled time by Europeans, there were bison in this region. So that just shows you how different this land was and how much it's been changed over time. So, and you know, the first features that probably pop out at you looking at this map are the Powhatan and the Susquehannock people. They are engraved in England by William Hull. These are not drawings that John Smith made, and they are based on engravings by the publisher Theodore de Brie, who is not someone who had ever actually seen a Native American. He was an important Flemish cartographer who published lots of images of Native Americans of North and South America, despite never seeing a single one. And he's using artistic motifs from Brazil that are not accurate for North American tribes, and they're not that accurate for Brazil either, in fact. So I've included some examples of some of his other engravings and other images that would have influenced this one. And again, they have nothing to do with colonial Virginia. These are artistic motifs that are making their way around the world at this time. But coming back to, and they also, it's worth noting these feather headdresses, they become really popular, but these are a Tupinambá feature of the Tupinambá people of Brazil. So this is also something that is not specific to the Powhatan tribe, even though you see this in the image. And also the Susquehannock stance here of this is described a giant Susquehannock person. This is a pose, and the design of the kind of sinews of the muscles and everything. This is a very mannerist European representation for what people look like. This is very much a type. This is not meant to be a realistic portrait. Not that it didn't sell very well anyway, of course, which was the whole reason to use these artistic representations. And a note about these people. So the Powhatan Confederacy and the Piscataway people I mentioned earlier, who are not shown here, but they are actually on the map in this region here along the Potomac River. So these are also interrelated with the Nanticoke people I mentioned earlier, living in what's now Delaware. These are people who speak an Algonquian language, and they're traditionally farmers living along waterways. And if, like me, you grew up with the Disney Pocahontas film, the naming is a bit confusing here because Powhatan was a chiefly title, sort of like Pharaoh, that was also used to name the individual, but could also refer to this entire suzerainty of tribes that lived along the rivers of Virginia at this time, and notably still do today. Now, the Susquehannock people to the north, also called the Conestoga, spoke an Iroquoian language, and they were hunters, much more big game, wide-ranging hunters. Their territory ranged from what's now Baltimore County well into central Pennsylvania, and they are thought to have been largely wiped out because of their history. There was susceptibility to disease and involvement in various wars during the 18th century that came from the north, but they may still have descendants in Western New York and also in Oklahoma Indian Territory. I also want to note that there is a phenomenon that was first named in 1960 as the myth of the vanishing Indian that sort of describes these people as having completely disappeared. However, the Powhatan and the Piscataway people are still very much alive and present in this region. I'm going to come back to this later, but they were erased on paper because of Jim Crow laws, which meant that they were often marked as colored on census and government records when the only distinction was colored or white. This is a part of Jim Crow that we don't often think of, but that was really devastating for the sovereignty of indigenous nations in this area. However, they've continued to live in their ancestral homelands despite the significant discrimination and all the ancestral treaties that were nullified by colonial governments. Several have recently gained state recognition. The Maryland state government recognized the Piscataway Conoy tribe in 2012, and they still live on their ancestral lands of what's now Prince George's County. And there are 8 Powhatan descended tribes that are recognized by the state of Virginia. The process of recognition started in earnest after the Loving versus Virginia decision in 1967, which overturned the Racial Integrity Act and is well known for being the act that legalized interracial marriage after a century-long ban. But it also meant that Native Americans could begin correcting their birth certificates to accurately reflect their heritage. And because of that, tribes in Virginia, but elsewhere, began getting recognized at least at the state level in the 1980s. Federal recognition has stalled several times in Congress for these tribes, which is not a story that I can give the space that it deserves right now. But that statement I linked earlier to the Association for Research Libraries talks about this a little bit if you would like to learn more. So all that being said, life here is kind of the blueprint for European settlements that you see later. The names of the indigenous nations along the shoreline get sparser and sparser, and the English names will increase and increase. You'll notice this in the next few maps. The shores of the bay and these dendrite-like rivers are all important, and the right to settle it will be decreed, fought for, and delineated over and over again. It's also notable, before I move on, the area that's now Baltimore, doesn't really feature in at all, and you see there's some trees. Baltimore was all forest at this point in history. It wasn't built up because it was neutral territory between the Piscataway and the Susquehannock peoples, who lived comfortably separated from each other in Maryland. And though the city wasn't a settlement point, we know that the local tribes fished in the Patapsco River, and there's archaeological evidence of habitation here that's been dated to at least 10,000 years ago. So like European settlers, the indigenous nations that lived here also migrated and built diverse societies over many centuries with social changes as time went on. And a last note that I meant to mention earlier, and I apologize, with Map Librarian goggles, you kind of forget to say these things, but probably the first thing you noticed when I started talking about this map and relating to north, south, et cetera, is that north is not at the top. This is a very common convention or in early maps before projections start to use north at the top more commonly. And another point about this is that this is also a very practical thing to do. If you're dealing with waterway navigation, you want to show how the ship is coming into the harbor. And so that would mean in this case that east should be at the bottom because the ships are coming from the east in order to enter the Chesapeake Bay. And entering the Chesapeake Bay along Virginia and then into Maryland is how people approach Maryland for the next couple of centuries. That really doesn't change until the railroads and then later on until flight, essentially. So the next phase of growth, and again, I've got these images. Now we're coming to what is famously called the Lord Baltimore Map. This is another one of our maps that if you've seen any of them, you've probably seen this one. So John Ogleby published, it's based on an earlier 1635. And here you do see Maryland by name. It's spelled out in Latin at the top for us as Terra Mariae. I'm getting a notification that my internet connection is unstable. So if the reference to this on the text under the family crest, which also refers to the family's other province in Newfoundland called Avalon. Charles I grants it to them, they are a Catholic family, as a 12 million acre.
Hi, everyone. If you just give us a minute, I am sure that she will rejoin us.